It's a pleasure to be joined by Mike Ter Maat, who is running for president representing the Libertarian Party. Mike, honored to be with you today.
It's absolutely my honor and joy to be with you,
Thank you. Welcome to the David Lynn
much.
Report, and congratulations on your candidacy, which you announced last year.
I appreciate
Before you are, currently running for president, you served as a police officer for 10 years.
I did.
You worked for the White House Office of Management Budget.
Yes.
So let's
Which is a different job.
very different.
Two different jobs.
So tell us about you, and then we'll talk about your candidacy.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think my candidacy is arguably more interesting than I personally am. I did have two different careers in public service and public policy. I did work as a professional economist for a couple of decades. It did include a couple of years with the White House.
PhD in economics from George Washington University. Yeah,
I studied at George Washington University, a very free market, pro-market environment. In that sense, I was very lucky. It served me well in my career. And I'd grown up coming out of business school as sort of a Milton Friedman type of guy. So that fit very well for me. And I worked for a couple of other agencies, worked in the financial services businesses as a free market advocate for quite a few years, had my own business in strategic consulting and educating financial services professionals, taught economics at 3 different universities.
Yeah.
And then, went to the police academy and launched my second career in public policy, public service as a police officer, something I had always wanted to do and just put it off. And I'm sure many in your audience can appreciate, once you reach 49, it's time not to put it off any longer.
You also ran for the candidacy of the Florida district.
Yes.
So when did you get into politics?
Well, then, depending on your definition of politics, I ran for Congress in District 20 in South Florida as a libertarian. That was 2 years ago now. Fantastic experience, frustrating experience, as you might imagine. The value of the Libertarian Party brand is pretty minimal. In some places, some people might argue that it's negative. But the Libertarian Party brand, when people understand it, is an important one. We are the philosophical descendants of the people that put together the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, that built this nation on the idea that we need a government of delimited powers, that we need a government whose business it is to protect our individual liberties and freedoms, and that's it. That's the idea behind libertarianism. So it's a powerful brand when people understand it, but running for Congress, you learn that most Americans are not familiar with the party, even though they do have a libertarian streak philosophically.
So, Mike, why are you running for president?
To build up that brand. I think it's not just a huge opportunity in 2024 for libertarians. I think it's an obligation, David. In that sense, what I mean by that is the United States government is going in the wrong direction. I believe the government now views its role as playing in every aspect of our lives. And I believe that Americans ethically and philosophically reject that fundamentally. But it's hard to break out of that mold given the way the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have played lately and how they interact with each other. There's a growing sense of authoritarianism in the United States and around the world, parenthetically. And a lot of that comes from the Democratic and Republican parties having left behind their policy agenda and now fight for nothing more really than to keep the other one out of power. That's where authoritarianism comes from, the idea that they would leverage our fear in order to promote the idea that what you really have to worry about is not the loss of your civil liberties, but that other idiot coming to power. That's where authoritarianism grows in a democracy. And for this reason, I think it's up to us as libertarians to step up and say, enough is enough. We need to fight our way back to the Constitution and limit the government in its power and in its scope to being playing an important role in protecting our civil liberties, but that's it. And that plays out in any number of ways, public policy.
Can you give us a few examples, hard examples, of how our civil liberties are more challenged today than maybe 20 or 30 years ago?
Absolutely. As a police officer, for example, I can tell you that the war on drugs has gone way too far. I would argue that it was never an ethical proposition. I don't believe that the government has the right, however you feel about drugs. And if anyone out there can hear my voice, I am no advocate of participating in drugs. But having said that, the appropriate vehicle is not the government of the United States or any particular state to tell you how to live your life. Having said that, as a cop, you quickly learn ethics aside, as an empirical matter, the war on drugs has not worked. It has not kept people from becoming addicted. It has not helped keep people away from drugs. What it does is it creates black markets.
Okay.
It drives these markets underground. This is what makes them so dangerous. For example, the number of fentanyl deaths that we've had in the United States is driven, obviously, by this very dangerous, very powerful drug. But the real underlying problem is one of fraud, one of mismanagement, one of not having trusted providers, for example, not having a market that's out in the open. When we drive these markets underground, they become extremely dangerous. And for that reason, we have failed to fight drugs as a medical problem, which is what it really is all about. And I believe that's the way we need to fight that. That's just one example.
Right.
But I do believe that Americans are ready for a much more robust anti-war message, a much more robust anti-inflation message. I think that Americans are much more ready for a message that talks about the fact that our government is too big, takes too much of our money, spends too much of our money.
I'd like to talk about the economy now and focus on what you think the government is doing wrong. You mentioned earlier that you think the government is taking too much of our money. How exactly are they doing that?
Well, the government does tax us in a tremendous fashion. That's the number one way. But close on the heels in terms of how it takes money from us is the way that it devalues our currency.
Yeah.
We've had a tremendous amount of inflation over the past couple of years. It's been building up because the Federal Reserve System did embark on this program of allowing a mushroom of the monetary base in the United States, of the dollar, and did so apparently under the belief that it would not lead to a tremendous amount of inflation. We know that that was an errant belief now, and now it's trying to fight its way back to a 2% inflation rate. I would argue that a 2% inflation rate is still too high, that the target that we should be going for is 0. I believe that the Federal Reserve System, a wonderful attempt, a wonderful experiment,
Right.
and I myself have worked with Fed economists over the years for whom I have tremendous respect, so none of this is personal.
Sure.
Right? I've met with the Federal Reserve Board in the boardroom itself. I've had my research on the banking industry cited by the Fed chairman.
Right.
But having said that, the Fed has proven over the last 100 years that it is utterly incapable of living up to the mandate of fighting the boom-bust cycle. Good intentions notwithstanding, it should be replaced, in my view. Instead of having a discretionary monetary policy, we should have a rules-based system. Janet Yellen was someone for whom a lot of us economists had a tremendous amount of respect before she became involved in the Federal Reserve System directly, before she became Fed chairman, because she was all about seeking out what the appropriate rules should be for pursuing and guiding monetary policy. This is the track that we need to get back on. We need to find the right rules. In my estimation, the way to do this is an old Milton Friedman idea of locking into a fixed rate of expansion for the monetary base. Pick a number, 1%, 2%, something that would be in line with approximate real GDP growth, so that your target would be approximately a zero inflation growth target.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you about that. The Austrian School of Economics, people who follow that school tend to believe that inflation is defined as the expansion of the money supply. So if you're targeting a 0% inflation rate, does that imply no expansion of the money supply and therefore no economic growth? Or am I getting that wrong?
I would target a zero inflation by virtue of picking an expansion factor for monetary base that's approximately in line with GDP in a real sense. So if you anticipated GDP growth to be 2%, right, in the long run,
Sure.
or 3%, that would be the number that I would say that we should commit to for the expansion of the monetary base. And lock that in. Come hell or high water, you
Right.
can't get off of that growth rate for monetary base. That money supply being fixed means that if there was any significant change in the rate of inflation, investors would be able to interpret that as being something to do with the business cycle and they wouldn't be in the weird position that investors are in today, which is when we have changes in inflation, you need to figure out, you have to guess,
Right.
well, is this more because of the business cycle or is this more because of what the Fed is doing? And it complicates matters in a way that is not helpful to investors making good, rational decisions.
I think a lot of investors, or even just regular Americans, would like to understand, even today, what caused inflation over the last 2 years. What's your explanation?
A ridiculous expansion of the monetary base.
Okay.
That was driven in part because the Fed made a conscious decision to expand the money base in order to grow out of the 2008 financial crisis, which, parenthetically, just by the way, was a crisis that was fostered by bad public policy in the first place. Having said that, our fiscal policy is one that also contributes to inflation because we bring a tremendous amount of money into the Treasury Department through taxation.
Yeah.
But then we spend way more than that.
Right.
Right? This sets up pressure for the Fed to monetize a lot of that debt. This is a big problem.
Okay. And when we're talking about why the Federal Reserve expanded the money supply, can you offer an explanation? Because that's something what a lot of people would like to know.
Well, I think the Fed expanded the money supply believing that, first of all, we had to monetize the tremendous debt that we have on the books. I think that that's been an underlying and unspoken objective of the Federal Reserve System. But the number one reason is because the Fed believed that it could accelerate growth without paying the price in terms of inflation.
Right.
And that we had to engage in a policy of expansion because of the 2008 recession.
I remember when the pandemic first hit, the discussion was, why is the Fed engaging in elemented QE? Well, I think the government explanation, or the official explanation, is to save us from a disastrous economic collapse.
Right.
Which didn't really come, one might argue, because of the stimulus. Could you argue in favor of why they did what they did and perhaps preventing us from an outright collapse?
No. Look, the expansion of the money supply, you're right, was accelerated with this idea that we had a crisis in our economy because of COVID.
Sure.
However, the economic crisis that we faced because of COVID was not because of the virus. It was because of our government's reaction to the virus.
I understand.
It was the government shutting down big parts of our economy or otherwise precluding our economy from working as efficiently as it had been.
So it was a self-inflicted wound that the government had to fix.
And that style of self-inflicted wound on the supply side is not something that you can offset by pumping greater amounts of money into the economy. Indeed, we saw the savings rate skyrocket. A lot of the cash that the government pumped into the system was not spent.
Right.
Indicating that it was the wrong policy. Even if you believe that that was good policy in certain circumstances, which I don't,
Right.
this was not a circumstance in which that policy even could work.
So the argument that the stimulus checks were not free, we pay for it with inflation. Could you make that argument?
Not only did we pay for it, we overpaid for it. Not only do we have to pay all that money back, but it did nothing for the underlying problem, which was a supply side problem of our government shutting down how the economy was supposed to be working.
Right.
So it was a real problem. And, of course, it shifted resources from one part of the economy to another.
If you're in the White House, how would you solve the inflation problem once and for all? If somebody were to ask you, how would you prevent inflation from going back to 9% in the future?
The first thing you have to do is replace the leadership of the Federal Reserve System with economists who believe in a rules-based system and not a discretionary system where we're just trying to guess at how to lean against the boom-bust cycle. That's the first step. The next step is to winnow down the power of the Federal Reserve System politically by making Fed regulation, for example, discretionary up to the banking system, taking away the Fed balance sheet and putting it under the auspices of the Treasury Department, making bailouts subject to legislation, for example, which is no silver bullet. The legislature can still do dumb things. I'm not arguing that it can't, but it would make it more difficult for the Fed to build up this enormous political power through its enormous balance sheet of resolving crises for us through bailouts whenever that they crop up. And once you reduce the political power of the Federal Reserve System, you could, in a matter of a few years, once and for all, move legislation to sunset the Federal Reserve System as we know it today, lock, stock, and barrel.
The Federal Reserve has two mandates in the U.S. It's unique in that not all central banks have two mandates, which is to fight inflation and control unemployment. If we were to reduce the powers of the Federal Reserve, who's going to fight inflation? Who's going to help us maximize employment?
In the long run, the way to maximize employment is by having a steady currency.
Okay.
In that sense, I do believe the dual mandate is a misnomer. I don't believe that the Fed internally pays a great deal of attention to the second half of the mandate, which is the reason why they don't fight it harder than they do. Because as a practical matter, I think that they just don't pay much attention. I don't think they care. Because they realize that in the long run, the best way to go about managing an economy is by controlling inflation. Having said that, they just do a crappy job of managing inflation, best efforts notwithstanding.
Right.
And for this reason, I believe that we need to sunset the second mandate, and the first mandate of maintaining a consistent currency, the strength of our currency. I believe that we need to replace discretionary policy with a rules-based system.
Is the labor market right now, we've talked about inflation, let's talk about the other side. Is the labor market right now in danger? The unemployment rate is still relatively low by historical standards. President Biden has indicated that the economy is doing well because the labor market on paper is still strong. Do you agree with the sentiment?
There are concerns about the labor market today. It's very different. It's a different animal to predict than 15 years ago.
Okay.
There is a tremendous overhang in our economy of folks who have dropped out of the labor force. And so I worry about that. I don't believe any longer you can look at the unemployment rate and take that as an indicator of the strength of our underlying economy. Yeah, we're all glad to have an unemployment rate of 4% instead of 5%. There's no question about that. That is better. But having said that, the real thing that we need to look at is the overall growth rate of our labor force. And that needs to be much more robust than it has been. So I do worry what comes next. If the Fed is not able to bring inflation under control, and we did have a good inflation number released just a few days ago.
Yes.
So there's reason to be optimistic. If that holds up, theoretically we could have a soft landing next year against inflation. But we're not out of the woods yet. If we see another bad number for inflation, and the Fed continues to clamp down, we still have a serious threat of inflation, of a recession next year.
Next year. Yeah, that's what Americans would like to know, whether or not we're heading into a recession. And you said there's a risk of a recession.
I still believe that we're at 50-50. I used to be way over 50-50, but now having seen a better inflation number at the same time as having a decent unemployment number, indicating that labor markets are not as tight as we were afraid that they would be.
What's a bad inflation number for you? You said bad inflation.
A bad inflation number would be north of 4%.
Okay.
If it's coming down 4, 3.5, 3, 2.5, 2, that's the path that you want to be on.
Yeah.
But if it proves stubborn around 4, the Fed is going to continue to have pressure to clamp down, and then we'll be looking at a recession.
Suppose we have a recession next year. Well, whenever that may be. Later this year, I've heard is also an estimate. Would that be the government's fault that we have a recession, or as an economist, you might say that this is just a normal part of the business cycle?
Business cycles are normal. We don't have a way of figuring out how to tame those. I'll give you that.
Okay.
But the government has exacerbated our business cycle problem.
Mm-hmm.
We've already had 2 technical recessions, 2 of them since COVID. This could be a third. There is no way to argue that that's a normal business cycle projection. That is something that we have not seen in the past, is rapid boom-bust cycles. Thankfully, they haven't been as deep as 2008, right?
Yeah.
But the rapid speed of which we go into and come out of recessions is something that, yeah, you have to lay at the feet of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, labor force participation rate has been declining over the last few decades. Is this a concern for you, or is this normal?
It's neither. It's neither normal nor a concern per se.
Okay.
To the extent to which people make decisions about whether or not they want to participate in the labor force, you do you and you knock yourself out. The economy will react to that.
Okay.
Wage rates will come up in response.
But are they not participating in a choice or because they just don't have jobs?
The long-term secular trend is one of choice.
Okay.
And of course, the availability of jobs is an endogenous factor in how you make those choices.
Right.
So yes, but the recent dip, which is not part of the long-term secular trend, but the more recent dip in the labor force participation rate was because of bad COVID policy. That we need to see come back up to its long-term secular trend, albeit a downward trend. We need to see that come up, and then we'll know that we're back into a healthy economy. We're not there yet.
Mike, how do we create more jobs for Americans?
Pro-free market solutions, pro-trade, pro-market, minimal regulation, allowing the banking industry to operate the way it was intended. We need to back up a great deal, not only on banking regulation, but on trade regulation. We need a much more pro-growth attitude out of the executive branch of the government. We need a much more pro-growth attitude in terms of how we deal with the rest of the world. Problem, both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have moved in a way that indicates that they no longer have an interest in a pro-growth attitude. Neither party is pro-free trade. Neither party is pro-free market. This is a real problem. If you are interested in a pro-free market set of solutions, the Libertarian Party is the only choice you have in the next political cycle.
Do you agree with the notion that if we were to trade more heavily with other nations, we would be hurting our workers domestically because we're effectively outsourcing jobs to other countries?
Not in the long run. To the extent to which jobs are cost, it's because they had been protected. That is the bad public policy that we need to get away from. We need to avoid continuously going through these cycles where we protect an industry, we artificially build up the labor pool in that industry, then we open it up to competition.
Right.
We lose jobs there. The dislocation is extremely painful. That is the result of bad public policy.
Well, what is the competitive advantage of, let's say, the American economy? I know it's very, very diverse, probably the most diverse economy in the world. If you were to take, let's say, a specific nation, let's say Japan in the 80s would be automobiles and electronics, the Middle East, oil. What's America's strength?
Information technology.
Okay.
No question about it. The United States is poised to lead the world in terms of the development, application, the implementation of artificial intelligence, blockchain technology. We are going to hit an inflection point in the next few years. I can't pinpoint exactly when, but soon, not 10 years from now, we are going to hit an inflection point in the development of the smart economy, when we are going to have to be very good at running contracts, inventories, as well as financial transactions on blockchain technology. And that is going to require keeping the federal government out of biasing the way these markets develop. If these markets are biased, if they are overregulated by the federal government of the United States, these technologies will, and their leadership, will move offshore. They will develop one way or another, but they won't develop as efficiently as they could if we can keep the federal government out of it.
Yeah, let's talk about blockchain technology for a few minutes. What is your view on the development of blockchain and how it's going to be more heavily integrated into our economy and our way of life?
It's going to change everything. Everything that we do in terms of conducting business online will change because we can keep track of transactions, because we can develop trust between institutions by revealing information from one institution to another, because the underlying information, the underlying contracts, the underlying inventory, the ability to track where product is, all of that can run on blockchain and do so in a way that doesn't have to get interrupted by government interference. It can be automated in a way that allows just-in-time management without the disclosure of information that would jeopardize your privacy vis-a-vis the federal government of the United States. This could make it a very desirable way to do business. This is the way that the American economy should be leading the world in the development of blockchain. We need to allow digital currencies to compete to see which one is best able to fulfill this mandate and play this role. And for this reason, it's particularly important to keep the Fed out of the issuance of a digital currency, because I'm afraid it would bias these markets toward its own currency, toward its own management of blockchain technology, and it would undermine the development of the currencies that compete, but it would also undermine individual privacy in the long run.
I have a feeling as to how you're going to answer the next question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. What are your views on the government's adopting a central bank digital currency, CBDCs for short? Do we need a Fed coin?
We need to throw ourselves on the track and make this stop. The Fed says it is waiting for enabling legislation. At the moment, we can believe them. But I do believe in the long run that if that enabling legislation is not forthcoming in a timely fashion, the Fed will eventually find a way to circumvent that.
Why do you think governments all over the world are adopting CBDCs? It's not just the Fed. It's more than 100 countries around the world working on this right now.
I believe that they all want to compete with the U.S. dollar. I think that's a noble ambition, that if they can develop a currency that makes sense for them, then maybe they don't have to be as reliant on the U.S. dollar. And there are certain reasons why you might be skeptical of continuing to rely on the U.S. dollar. Certainly you don't want to be controlled by Washington in terms of the privacy of your transaction.
You can de-dollarize without digitizing your currency.
You can, and certain places have tried to do that, but this is another way to try to accelerate how that's done and take matters into your own hands. There are also governments around the world who don't sufficiently trust their private sectors. In some cases, their private sectors don't have the resources to develop these technologies on their own, and so they're trying to accelerate that.
Well, let's segue into foreign policy now. Perfect segue. What is your view on the de-dollarization trend that a lot of economists have talked about? Several decades ago, the dollar represented about 80% of total international trade in nominal dollar terms, and now it's about 60%. And so people are worried that the dollar will no longer in the future become the hegemonic currency or the reserve currency of the world. Is that a trend that you think will continue?
The trend will continue, but I don't see another currency replacing the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency anytime soon. There is no competitor that exists today that is set up to play that role in the future.
The BRICS are set to work on a basket.
They are set to work. I would not be terribly optimistic for a BRICS currency.
Why is that?
The underlying economies I don't find particularly impressive. I also don't find terribly impressive the cohesion among those economies. They all have their particular idiosyncrasies. And of course, that's what undermines a currency. When you have underlying economies that are very different one from another, the European experience is, in our recent memory, it's very difficult to have a German economy and a Greek economy tied to the same currency successfully. But I would also hasten to add that a BRICS currency, including the letter C, I would be pessimistic about any currency holding up if the underlying economies included China. I think that they are a poorly managed, poorly directed economy about which I would be very, very pessimistic in the medium to long term.
The Chinese economy.
Exactly.
They are projected by economists to become the world's largest economy by, people have different goalposts.
For about 20 minutes before India overtakes them.
For about 20 minutes before India. But America will still be number 3 in that picking order.
That may be.
Size.
I like where we are.
Okay.
Look, the Chinese management of their economy is one of the few governments in the world that makes ours look really smart. I would not bet on the Chinese economy because of their government.
Okay.
I think that they pursue bad trade policies. They pursue bad intellectual property policies. They pursue bad industrial policies. They pursue bad currency policies. one of the things that, as an example, the Chinese government spends a lot of energy talking about the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think, we all as Americans have some appreciation for the idea that trade being so important. If the government's going to invest in anything, it should be investing in the idea of helping the interoperability of how we trade with our partners. So I get all of that attitude. However, I don't believe it's a good idea to double down on what is absolutely 20th century technology.
Right.
In the 21st century that is accelerating rapidly. I don't believe in industrial policy full stop. But if you're going to try to sell me on an industrial policy, it's not going to be based on 20th century technology.
Xi Jinping has made it pretty clear that one of his mandates is to become the world superpower at some point during his
at least in the Pacific and possibly worldwide.
Right. So what does that mean for American dominance, and what does that mean for foreign policy with China?
I do believe that he's barking up an inefficient tree. This is another reason why I'm not sanguine on the Chinese economy. If they are going to take the resources of their hardworking citizens and dedicating it to the projection of military hegemony in the Pacific and possibly worldwide, they're wasting their money. Indeed, I wish the United States government would stop wasting so much of our money projecting military hegemony around the world. I don't believe that NATO is any longer in our interest, for example. I believe that we can start bringing troops home, reducing our commitment to protecting the European nations who should be spending, ethics aside, efficiency aside, just fairness. They should be spending a larger proportion of their GDP if they really feel that they have something that concerns them in their defense posture. They should be their own plan A. The U.S. government should not be their plan A.
So we should spend less on the military.
Absolutely.
I'll give you an interesting argument against that I've heard. If you look at history, especially over the last 200 years, you'll notice that the most amount of wars that have broken out happened during periods of when there was no one or two dominant superpowers in the world, meaning a lot of different countries vying for power in their respective spheres of influence.
Right.
The times that we've had the most world peace, when we've had the fewest armed conflicts around the world, were actually times when we had dominant superpowers in place. The Cold War is one. The British Empire is another example. And so the argument here is that we've had peace and prosperity over the last 50 years precisely because we've invested so much into our military-industrial complex. How would you respond to that?
I appreciate that. The amount of money at stake is an order of magnitude greater than the problem that we're trying to solve. We are in arms race with ourselves. The current posture of the United States Defense Department is that we could win a war against the rest of the world combined. Let that sink in, including our partners. If the rest of the world combined were to wage war against the United States of America, we would win. I would argue that that is a goal that is too high, that is too expensive a proposition. We should be in a posture that absolutely guarantees that no one would think even once, much less twice, about attacking the United States. We can achieve that with a quarter of the defense spending that we make today. Our partners should be stepping up to the plate in terms of defending themselves. Under a libertarian administration, the president on January 21st would give a phone call to each of the heads of European states saying, this is your 18-month heads up. It's time for you to step up to the plate in terms of providing your own plan A. If you believe that you need to spend 2.5%, 3.5% of GDP on defense, now's the time to start doing it.
The cornerstone of U.S.-China relations is the recognition of the one China policy, which is that Taiwan is not an independent state. If you were president, would you still respect that policy, or would you seek to make other sorts of arrangements?
Our policy in China has been arguably the dumbest foreign policy in the United States history.
Okay.
There is no such thing as a relationship which is made better because of strategic ambiguity. I think your viewers would agree. If they were to turn to their spouse or anyone else in their family or in their place of work, much less international relations, and say, I'm going to treat this relationship as one of ambiguity, I think it's going to work out better.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen. The reason we have a very strange commitment to Taiwan at this moment is because we are afraid that if we don't back up Taiwan, we will lose control of a strategic pipeline of goods and services, mostly technology, mostly chips, mostly high-end chips in particular. This has been a self-fulfilling prophecy. We have accidentally allowed people to believe that if you were to invest billions of dollars in Taiwan, we would be there to back you up come hell or high water. Now the investments have been made, the factories have been built, and the supply chains have become absolutely critical to our underlying infrastructure. Now we believe that we have to back up Taiwan because we accidentally sent the signal that you could invest there and we would back you up.
Let me phrase this question differently. President Biden had said that if Taiwan were attacked, they would back Taiwan militarily. If you were president...
That's the wrong policy, the wrong attitude, and the wrong announcement.
So what would you do if, let's say, China invaded Taiwan?
We would have to back off.
Okay.
This is a civil war. Nobody likes the idea of China attacking Taiwan. Personally, I hate the idea. The reason it would affect our interests is because of our bad policy up until now. Now is the time to tell investors, if you've been building a factory in Taiwan because you believe that the military of the United States government was going to protect you, you've made a bad investment. Can I interest you in Milwaukee? Or anywhere else in the Pacific Rim?
Right.
But we haven't done that. And so we've backed ourselves into this, what I would argue to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, where we feel like we have to back up Taiwan. And that is not the right way to play what started out as a civil war, what has remained essentially a civil conflict.
Okay.
We cannot be, as much as we may prefer a certain outcome, we cannot continue to be the world's policeman. The price of doing so has gotten far too large. And by the way, David, and I believe that your viewers would agree with me here, we're not good at it. We are very good at tactical matters in terms of our projection of military power.
Sure.
We're good at killing people and blowing things up, taking ground, keeping ground. We're good at opening sea lanes and protecting sea lanes. We're even good at toppling governments, if you don't mind the secrets eventually coming out. But in terms of achieving long-term success that the American people would say, that was in our strategic interest, notwithstanding the billions that we spent, notwithstanding the thousands of lives that we lost. We just don't have those examples that Americans would point to and say, let's do more of that. We have proven in Afghanistan and Iraq are the obvious leading examples where it wasn't just thousands of lives lost, but including foreign nationals, hundreds of thousands of lives lost, and not just billions, but trillions of dollars. These were colossal failures. And so we need to admit that not just on an ethical basis, but an empirical, objective basis, we are not good at this, and we need to stop trying.
I think we've only got a few minutes left. So before we close off, I want to get your thoughts on the criminal justice system and how that should be reformed. You do have a background in law enforcement, so I'm curious to get your thoughts. What is wrong with our criminal justice system today?
A couple of things in two different buckets. One is the laws, the criminalization that we ask police officers to enforce.
Yeah.
We need to back off of the war on drugs, for example, and stop creating black markets. The criminal justice system in the United States...
Are you saying we should legalize the consumption?
Everything.
Okay.
I believe that has to be phased in to be accomplished. You begin that with marijuana. Once Americans become comfortable with the idea of complete legalization of marijuana, you will be able to move on to other non-addictive drugs and see how those markets work before taking the next step. Objectively speaking, we are not good at prosecuting a war on drugs in order to keep people off of drugs. What it does is it creates black markets, which attracts people who, because of bad other public policies, including bad schools, bad zoning, bad housing, especially schools, by the way, if I'm allowed to mention that twice, don't have the opportunities that many other Americans do and get drawn into these black markets as a fast way to make money. Then when you layer on top of that such an oppressive criminal justice system, this is what lands people in jail, breaks up families, breaks up communities. It's what creates a huge problem in the United States of this compelling, interminable, intergenerational poverty, which is so persistent, which would not be predicted by free markets,
Right.
but does continue because of bad public policy. So you have all that. And then in the other bucket, you have the way we manage police officers. That has to be handled in a much more pro-market fashion.
What's the response to defund the police movement?
It's not helpful. We need to reform the way that we manage police. That means market forces, greater competition among agencies, so that a city or a county or even a state could replace one contractor with another.
Yes.
In the town where I worked, they only had two choices, either our police department or the county sheriff's office.
Right.
And they would remind us once in a while that there is a little bit of competition, but two agencies is not enough competition. You need more than that. We also need to foster competition among the best police officers. We want the best officers to get paid more, the weaker officers to get paid less, and the worst to be fired completely.
Right.
So we need to work through those issues. By the way, they're largely the same issues in teaching, which is another place where public sector unions have choked off competition.
Excellent. Mike, I really appreciate you spending the time with our audience to educate us on your thoughts. Thank you very much. Good luck with your campaign.
A real pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Where can people follow your work and learn more from your campaign?
The basic campaign website is MikeTermaat.com, but you'd have to spell it right. MikeTermaat.
All right.
.com.
We'll put a link in the description. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more.